So I'd like to thank Sarah Beach from OMNR, my coworker Mike Connerton, and John Midwood of DFO, who could not be here today. So essentially, this was a gathering of both agency, academic, and other interest groups of folks working on Lake Ontario with a focus on walleye. I don't have presenter view. Oh. Okay, perfect. Okay, so essentially, walleye are an important component of commercial, indigenous, and recreational fisheries across the entirety of Lake Ontario. Stocks are generally dominated by fish from the Bay of Quinte area and the Eastern Basin. And catches overall have declined since the introduction of zebra mussels, but have remained relatively stable since. So in recent years, management agencies have noted some knowledge gaps across the lake, and noted some potential concerns with stock numbers in the Eastern Basin of New York. So walleye-oriented work and research has been underway in Lake Ontario for a number of years, but there's been a good need for communication between management agencies, academia, and other groups working towards walleye support and restoration in Lake Ontario. So we wanted to find some areas of overlap, common goals, and identify steps for future research projects. So for our workshop, we had several goals, and those were to discuss the general status of the various stocks in Lake Ontario through annual assessments and other surveys, update on the current state of science with a focus on walleye for Lake Ontario, identify broad-scale research gaps or areas that needed more focus, and any potential for future collaborative research projects. So there were three core workshop themes. So that was general stock status, and annual assessments, recruitment and early life history work, and spatial ecology and telemetry. So there were a total of 11 presentations given, and representatives from 7 agencies, universities, and other research groups. And several presentations were based on existing collaborations with various groups and agencies. So first up is stock status assessment. So researchers discussed topics like field methods. So Sarah alluded to some of those. We've got a lot of gill netting and trap netting assessments in the area, some trawling, current walleye population trends or stock status, current research and information gaps that we would like to consider when informing stock assessments, and concerns or uncertainties for walleye within specific regions. So we had several groups presenting on status of fisheries independent assessments in the Eastern Basin, the Western Basin, on both the Ontario and New York sides, and stock status in the Upper St. Lawrence River, as well as some discussions on stocking, population genetics, and then a broader discussion to bring all these topics together. So major findings for this section of our discussion were that there were fairly different values in terms of stock status from east to west. There was a fairly clear delineation in terms of numbers. I'll touch on that in the next slide. Some areas were fairly difficult to sample, with a major shout out to the Niagara River. It's tricky to gill net there for walleye. You're giggling. So there's a really big need to determine the relative contribution of different spawning stocks across the lake, as we don't really have that information now. There are areas that are more thoroughly assessed or we have more information on, and I'll get into that in a bit. And we discussed the possibilities of harmonizing some of our assessment methods or general analyses so that we can make direct comparisons between different lake areas. So we want to look at different small changes that could kind of unify how we're sampling. So maybe add different gill net panel sizes or find a way to scale our CUE results so it's a more direct comparison. So one of the really cool things that came out of this was we each basin area or sampling area brought in their own CUE data. And as we were discussing, we kind of put all of this up onto a big map. So it was super cool to actually see trends represented across the lake and into the St. Lawrence. So the yellow dots are areas where walleye numbers have been either stable or increasing. Areas in red are areas where the trends have kind of dipped a bit. Let's see. Starred areas are areas with current stocking. And as I mentioned, the Niagara is kind of tricky to sample. So looking at everything, sure, the scale for CUE is fairly different from one end to the other, but overall, we seem to have fairly stable or increasing trends on the east end of the lake into the St. Lawrence River, a dip in like Toronto Harbor or the Niagara River, but again, sampling difficulties. And we have a few areas that were historically stocked or are no longer stocked, and some that are still receiving some stocking. But this was really cool for a lot of us who hadn't seen numbers from other portions of the lake. So major findings have been that our stocking has primarily been focused on summer or pond fingerlings. There's been a drive to look at genetic approaches, including SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, to provide an increased resolution of walleye stock structure. There's currently work underway to re-explore stock structure that had previously been explored in the early 2010s in Lake Ontario using SNPs. So the graph on the bottom right was a look at walleye stock structure in Lake Ontario, some of the other stock sources in New York. So we have stuff like Oneida Lake, Sodus Bay, Chautauqua Lake. So that's the top lobe. We have some of our St. Lawrence River fish and Black River in New York's Eastern Basin fish on the left. Our Ontario fish in general had their own grouping in terms of genetic structure. And then we had kind of an anomalous cluster for Kents Creek and Mud Bay in New York. So they're going to be re-looking at a lot of these genetic samples in a more modern context, which is super exciting, and we can't wait to see how that shakes out. So for the recruitment section of our workshop, we looked at methods that we currently use to assess recruitment, what evidence we currently have for natural recruitment within each respective region, current research or research that's already occurred, and then concerns or other uncertainties in terms of recruitment for walleye in each of these basins. So these primarily focused on fish in Hamilton Harbor because they've been doing a lot of work over there, along with the Bay of Quinte, and some habitat enhancement projects that have occurred on the east side of Lake Ontario and into the St. Lawrence River. So generally, we found that we need to research more factors that influenced variation in terms of annual stock numbers and recruitment success. Primarily, a lot of these were abiotic factors, including temperature, wind, and water levels. There's definitely a need to document and share habitat assessment methods and varying levels of efficacy. And there's a need for more consistent or finding the best methods for evaluating recruitment. So sorting out which egg trap methods might work better in different environments, as some of our spawning rivers, especially in New York, are fairly volatile, and there's a lot of moving water in the spring. So our final section was telemetry and spatial ecology. So we looked at telemetry-based research questions, where we need to go with those topics, results that have already been released for current projects, research underway, and addressing any other outstanding questions that can be addressed with telemetry. So we found that there are fairly clear seasonal movements, especially for fish in the Bay of Quinte area that run out into the main basin of the lake and so in the summer and fall, and then return to the Bay of Quinte to overwinter. Spawning site fidelity, as Sarah mentioned, seems to be pretty strong in the Bay of Quinte. You could see everybody's favorite little ping pong of moving fish across the lake and the bay. And then there have been lake-wide movements of fish tagged at both the east and the west end of the lake. They're not confined to one lake region, which is also really cool to see. And even our St. Lawrence River walleye, tagged way down the river, will move into the lake at certain times of the year. So overall, common themes that stood out as a result of this workshop were a general desire to understand relative stock contributions of the various rivers along the lake, namely Bay of Quinte, St. Lawrence River, and Lake Ontario tributaries. And we're curious to know about seasonal variations and use of these fish, and if there's differences in stock preference and selection. We want to look at, the assessment sampling typically targets our mixed adult stocks, and I'll get into that in a moment. And we have a fairly robust telemetry network for the Bay of Quinte and the surrounding area. New York studies have been growing. There's been a concentrated effort to get more tags into more fish each year, and there's a lot of summer movement with common overwintering locations. So once again, looking at the relative contributions by stock, this is a really critical piece. So in the summer, when we're typically doing our community assessments, Eastern Basin net set sites in Ontario are intended to assess the adult biomass of the Bay of Quinte stock, while the New York assessments are a general adult abundance in the region. From the telemetry evidence that we have so far, it looks like the fish that are sampled during this period are typically of mixed stocks. And there are local, for us in New York, recreational both sides have recreational fisheries that exist, which may seasonally exploit mixed stocks. And as Sarah showed, there's high catch rates of walleye in New York in the summer and early fall, and then it drops through winter and early spring, potentially suggesting that there's a smaller contribution by New York fish in that area. So telemetry and genetic analysis are both great options for kind of evaluating this knowledge gap. So future directions. We want to collaborate to improve future comparisons of our different assessments across both lake areas and agencies. We have several years of telemetry data that have already been covered or collected. So we want to review the data and see where there's areas of stock mixing or separation, if there's distinctions between each spawning group. We want to better coordinate future telemetry work to find more options to evaluate these mixing stocks and use genetic approaches such as SNPs to determine stocks and find the best practices that can work basin-wide so we all have comparable data. So one of the very cool things about this was we were able to generate several grassroots breakout groups. These aren't working groups per se, but they're ways that we connected people with similar interests across the agencies and universities involved. So we have loose groups for people to discuss stocking approaches and assessments, harmonizing long-term assessments, more unified creel survey approaches and methods, understanding different stock contributions and origins, a group to work on habitat enhancement and evaluation, a general spatial ecology and telemetry group, groups that are more aligned with recruitment assessments or early life history data collection, and looking at abiotic drivers of recruitment. So there's been a ton of interest in advancing basin-wide collaborative research on walleye. There's lots of work that's already underway and even more planned in the coming years across the Eastern Basin and the St. Lawrence River, especially in the telemetry field. We found that collaboration and discussion can facilitate the development of consistent data sets to provide cross-basin perspectives. And working with both management and researchers at the table allows to ensure everybody's goals are aligned. So too often there's not necessarily talk between one side and the other. So if we can work together, we can make sure everybody's goals are met, and we can facilitate better direction and guidance to kind of help better inform management decisions. And overall, it was an awesome opportunity for a collaborative researcher and connected a bunch of people that wouldn't typically be working alongside one another. And with that, we're done. Any questions?